Honourable Senators, Rule 12-32 outlines procedures in a committee of the whole. In particular, under paragraph A, B, and D, senators wishing to speak shall address the chair. Senators need not stand or be in their assigned places to speak. And senators have 10 minutes to speak, including questions and answers. Je désire rappeler aux honorables sénateurs.
Honorable Senators, the Committee of the Whole is meeting pursuant to an order adopted by the Senate on December 14, 2017. The committee will hear from the Honorable Jody Wilson-Raybould, PC, MP, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, the Honorable Ginette Petitpas-Taylor, PC, MP, Minister of Health, the Honorable Ralph Goodale, PC, MP, Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, and Mr. Bill Blair,
Minister of Justice, and the Attorney General of Canada and the Minister of Health. The witnesses will be accompanied by Simon Kennedy, Deputy Minister of Health, François Daigle, Sous-Ministre Délégué de la Justice,
François Daigle, Associate Deputy Minister of Justice, and Vincent Rigby, Associate Deputy Minister of Public Safety.
Sure. Thank you for being here with us today, honorable senators and witnesses. I know that we only have 2 hours. Ministers, we only have 2 hours for this committee, and there are a great number of questions that people wish to ask to you. So I encourage both you and the senators to be reasonably succinct in your questions and answers. This will allow as many senators as possible to participate. My understanding is that the ministers have agreed to take no more than 15 minutes for their opening remarks. You may begin. Thank you.
Well, thank you, honourable senators. It's my pleasure to join with my colleagues and the parliamentary secretary to appear before you, Committee of the Whole on Bill C-45. This legislation proposes a major shift in Canadian public policy. Our commitment to legalize and strictly regulate cannabis responds to the fact that Canada's current approach is not working. Despite prohibition, Canadian youth continue to use cannabis at some of the highest rates in the world. Thousands of Canadians end up with criminal records for minor cannabis offences each year, and organized crime reaps huge profits from the sale of cannabis while exposing consumers to health and safety risks. Bill C-45 proposes a better approach, one rooted in public health. In proposing this bill, the government was informed in large part by the advice it received from the Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulation in its December 2016 final report, a report that the Honourable Anne McClellan, chair of the task force, described as, quote, a result of a truly national collaboration, end quote. I would also like to acknowledge the importance of this chamber's comprehensive 2002 report that called for the legalization and regulation of cannabis. The collaborative work of federal, provincial, and territorial officials that has been ongoing since the summer of 2016, the work of the Standing Committee on Health in hearing nearly 100 witnesses and improving the bill, and the work of government officials in laying the groundwork for the implementation of the Act. From the outset, our government has been clear that a new framework for regulating and restricting access to cannabis must achieve several objectives, which are reflected in Clause 7 of Bill C-45. Our legislation will protect the health and safety of Canadians, particularly that of our youth, and deter and reduce illicit activities in relation to cannabis. Honourable Senators, I would now like to briefly address the treatment of young people under Bill C-45. Our government's position is clear. Youth should not have any amount of cannabis. There will be no legal means for a young person to obtain recreational cannabis. We have introduced several measures to protect young people in the bill, including significant penalties for adults who distribute to young people and clearly defined prohibitions against advertising and promoting cannabis to youth. A robust public education and awareness campaign will also serve to educate youth and parents about cannabis risks. However, we have decided to exempt young people from criminal prosecution for possession or sharing very small amounts up to 5 grams of cannabis. Why? For these very small amounts, there is a better way to deal with youth than subjecting them to lifelong consequences that exposure to the criminal justice system can have for them. We have encouraged the province and the territories to create administrative offences, similar to what is done now for tobacco and alcohol, that give police the authority to ticket and seize small amounts of cannabis from youth. I'm happy to report that such prohibitions have been included in all recently introduced provincial cannabis legislation. I'm also aware of the concerns that province and territories will not be ready, that law enforcement will not be ready, and that more time is needed to implement this initiative. I would submit that the opposite is true. Provinces and territories have, in fact, been working expeditiously to position themselves for the implementation of the Cannabis Act. To date, 5 provinces have introduced cannabis legislation, with Ontario having passed Bill 174. The other jurisdictions have completed public consultations, and all but one have announced their planned framework. In closing, I would like to highlight the testimony of the Canadian Public Health Association before the Standing Committee on Health, where it said, quote, "Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of time, as Canadians are already consuming cannabis at record levels. The individual and societal harms associated with cannabis use are already being felt every day. The proposed legislation and eventual regulation is our best attempt to minimize those harms and protect the well-being of Canadians." I will now turn it over to my colleague, Minister Petitpas-Taylor.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Honourable Senators. I'm pleased to be here with you today to speak about Bill C-45. Over the past months, we have spoken with Canadians about this new cannabis legislation. Our aim with the proposed Cannabis Act is to do what the current system has failed to do, to prevent youth from accessing cannabis and protect public health by establishing strict quality requirements. We also want Canadians to make informed and responsible choices about cannabis and talk to their youth about the risks associated to cannabis. To this end, our government is investing $46 million in public education and awareness. Our government is committed to a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples. We must ensure that the unique needs of Indigenous peoples are addressed as we move towards a new cannabis framework. That's why the Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulation consulted national Indigenous organizations across the country, Indigenous communities, and elders. In addition, Canada's health ministers met with Indigenous leaders at the 2017 annual meeting. I have also personally reached out to the Assembly of First Nations, the ITK, and the Métis National Council to seek their active participation in consultation on the proposed regime. Indigenous peoples raised a number of diverse interests, including public health and safety, economic development opportunities, and issues of jurisdictions and authority. Health Canada officials continue to engage with national Indigenous organizations and communities to share information and identify opportunities for collaboration. Pendant son analyse du projet de loi,
During its analysis of the bill, the House debated whether or not it should amend the provisions concerning home growth. It would allow people to grow up to 4 plants per home by authorizing limited cultivation at home. First of all, it would prevent the needless criminalization of Canadians under the Act for Canadians who are growing a few plants for personal use, and then to contribute to putting an end to the illegal market. The approach that we're proposing follows the advice of the work on the working group on legalization of cannabis, and the approach adopted by most American states who legalize cannabis. Also, in no way will we allow for commercial operations in these homes.
Preparations for implementing the proposed legislation. Many of the questions that Canadians, members of Parliament, and other levels of government have asked relate to the implementation of the proposed legislation. For example, questions such as when can provincial retailers start taking possession of product? Or when will Canadians be able to legally consume cannabis in Canada? For close to a year now, our government has been working closely with provinces and territories and other partners to prepare an orderly and responsible transition. Provinces and territories are preparing from the start of a legal cannabis sales later this year by making progress in setting up legislation and infrastructure. As a practical matter, they told us that they need 8 to 12 weeks following royal assent for preparatory activities to occur, such as lawful movement of product from licensed producers to distribution and retail outlets, before legislation comes into force and Canadians can legally buy cannabis. Health Canada continues to engage national and community partners to share information related to implementation and ensure all levels of government are prepared for the prospective coming into force of Bill C-45. L'adoption du projet de loi.
The passing of Bill C-45 will be a milestone in Canadian history. We will be the first country in the G7 to adopt a public health approach to strictly regulate access to cannabis. Over the past 2 years, our government has conducted a rigorous analysis to table the bill that you are focusing on today. We are convinced that Bill C-45 will equip us with the best possible conditions to protect Canadians, particularly youth, against the risk tied to cannabis. Thank you, and now I will give the floor to my colleague, Minister Goodale.
Thank you for inviting us to be here today, and thank you for the careful attention that you are all giving to this important legislation. Throughout
the development of this new plan, which seeks to keep cannabis out of the hands of youth and to cut criminals off from the profits. The safety of Canadians has always been our #1 concern, and I am certain that it is a concern that we all share.
Canadians are among the heaviest and youngest users of cannabis in the world, to the great profit of criminals. Under the existing system, the illegal cannabis trade in this country puts at least $7 billion, that's with a B, $7 billion annually into the pockets of organized crime. And Canadian law enforcement spends upwards of $2 billion every year trying to enforce what is clearly an ineffective legal regime. With legalization, regulation, and strict control, we can enable the more effective use of law enforcement resources, and we can dramatically reduce the involvement of criminal elements in cannabis production and sales. In Washington state, for example, legalization recently shrank the criminal share of the cannabis market by almost 75%. That kind of improvement is obviously very significant from a public safety perspective. Another public safety concern related to cannabis is drug-impaired driving. As the Cannabis Task Force report points out, quote, cannabis-impaired driving is not a new challenge. It is a criminal offense that exists today and is a challenge that must be addressed irrespective of how or when the government legalizes cannabis. Drug-impaired driving has existed in the criminal code since 1925. And we are tackling the modern challenge head-on. We have proposed Bill C-46 concurrently before a Senate committee, which will strengthen our laws regarding driving while under the influence of both drugs or alcohol. We have launched a major public awareness campaign with public messages on social media, television, in movie theaters, and so forth, to inform Canadians, especially young Canadians, about the risks of driving impaired. And we have announced $274 million to support law enforcement agencies as they do the important frontline work of deterrence, detection, border protection, and punishment. Much of that funding will go toward training and equipping police, and some of it will go to the Canada Border Services Agency to enhance anti-smuggling efforts. It is important to be clear that under Bill C-45, it will remain illegal, as it is today, to take cannabis into or out of Canada. Border officers are already trained and equipped to interdict a range of controlled substances, including cannabis, and the new funding will bolster those efforts that already exist. Finally, while I'm on the subject of the border, I'd like to make sure that honourable senators are aware that I have discussed the impending changes to our cannabis regime with American officials, including the new U.S. Ambassador to Canada and the new Secretary of Homeland Security. It is naturally the prerogative of every country to make their own admissibility decisions when people present themselves at the border to enter a particular country. Canadians need to understand that Americans have the right to establish their own laws. But we have been making sure that the United States understands our approach to cannabis, our objectives in making the changes that we are proposing, and our expectation that all travelers going in both directions will be treated fairly and respectfully and consistently at the border in accordance with all relevant law. Honourable Senators, this has obviously been a very quick overview that we have provided in the last few moments of some of the matters related to Bill C-45 and C-46 from a public policy perspective. We want to thank you for your attention, and we look forward very much to your questions this afternoon.
Thank you very much, witnesses. And now I'll go to our first questioner, Senator Smith.
Very much. And thank you all for joining us today. Conservative senators will have a number of questions for you this afternoon on Bill C-45, both on the details of the legislation and on the ramifications of your government's decision to legalize marijuana. Briefly, I'd just like to point out that, as always on this side of the chamber, our senators will approach our work on Bill C-45 in the days and weeks ahead with the seriousness and careful attention that it deserves. Ministers, I would like to make it clear to you and to anyone else who may be watching that Conservative senators will not proceed in an obstructionist manner, as some in the media and elsewhere have seemed to suggest. I promise you, however, that we will give a voice to those in the Canadian public who have significant valid concerns about the policy choice your government is making. With that said, my first question, I have four of them, I'll try to be as quick as possible, is for the Minister of Justice. Minister, in the case of two state jurisdictions, Colorado and Washington, the coming into force of retail sales of marijuana occurred up to 18 to 24 months after the legislation had passed. It now appears that the government is suggesting that when others took up to 24 months to do so, and to ensure public safety can be done in a month or two. And as the Minister of Health said, the feedback that she's received is it takes 8 to 12 weeks after passage of the bill before sales can take place. And I quote, my question is this, Minister, have you carefully studied these two examples? And if so, can you tell us what is different here, given that this is a national initiative involving 13 other provincial and territorial governments, countless municipalities, and Indigenous communities?
Well, Thank you, Honourable Senator, for the question. I know you have three more, and I would invite my colleagues to chime in terms of the answer. But to be very clear, we have, as a government, been working on and working towards the legalization of cannabis for over 2 years now. We have benefited greatly from the report of the task force, as I mentioned, and the task force themselves traveled to these jurisdictions to learn from their experiences as they proceeded forward in terms of legalization. So we have learned lessons from those jurisdictions. We have benefited from letters that those jurisdictions, including the Governor of Colorado, that has sent to us. We are confident that we are on track. We have been very diligent in the work that we have done and continue to do in terms of working with the provinces and territories who have significant responsibilities under this proposed Cannabis Act, and we're going to continue to do that, continue to work with Indigenous governments. So I'm confident that we will be in a place for the legalization of cannabis July of 2018, and that a responsible process for implementation of the Act will continue thereafter.
If I may, if you don't mind, just to add as well, we also have to recognize that here in Canada, we are building on a medical cannabis regime that was already in place, that was introduced in 2013. And we have to recognize that the medical regime that has been put in place is extremely sophisticated, very well regulated, and highly professional. So the fortunate part, if I may, with respect to the non-medical regime that we are proposing, we can certainly build upon what's already in place. And that is certainly going to help us expedite the coming into force of this legislation.
My next set of questions is for you, Minister of Health, that we have to deal with public education, which is a good caveat from the first question. We have heard over and over from concerned stakeholders that there has simply not been enough time allowed for public education on this legislation in order to adequately protect our youth. Minister, you have said protecting youth is a central pillar of this legislation. Lessons learned from Colorado and Washington State indicate that we simply need more time in Canada to educate our youth before this huge societal shift. Taking into consideration the points you brought up about the pre-study and the work that's been done to this point, we can accept there has been work done to this point, but as Minister responsible for safeguarding the health and well-being of our youth, will you allow for more time to publicly educate our youth on the enormous risk to their health of using marijuana? If not, what is the rush? And I only say that based on the fact that a lot of studies been done, but in the States, they had a full-fledged program to educate the youth for a period of time before the actual sales took place. So the issue is, if we haven't put a program in place in terms of execution, then are we not putting ourselves in some form of a risk of having some problems in terms of our implementation?
Thank you very much for the question. The health and safety of our children is actually at the heart of why we're moving forward with the cannabis legislation. We recognize in Canada, when we look at the youth between the ages of 15 and 24, they are amongst the highest users of cannabis in Canada, but also of all developed countries. So we recognize that there's already a problem that's existing. We also are recognizing that we can learn a lot from our friends in Colorado and Washington with their implementation plan. We learned clearly from our friends in Colorado when they appeared before the task force that if they had to do it again, they would certainly put in place a public education approach before the matter became law. And that's exactly the approach that we're using. I'm proud that our government is investing $46 million in the area of public education and awareness to make sure that we can dispel the myths and to provide Canadians with the proper information regarding the health and safety issues regarding cannabis. By legalizing cannabis, in no way are we saying that it goes without risks, and we want Canadians to be aware of that information. I'm also very pleased that in November of 2017, my friend and colleague's department, through the Department of Public Safety, started a public education campaign regarding the harms associated to impaired driving. And that campaign has been very successful. We've received very positive feedback. I'm also pleased to report that we've been able to partner with groups that are already providing public education tools to Canadians. One of those examples you may be familiar with is the Drug-Free Kids program. we were able to partner with them, and they developed a wonderful program to equip parents, frontline workers, and also perhaps just people that children would go see if they wanted to have this conversation about cannabis. And so we were able to partner with them, and as a result, almost 180,000 of these kits were given across Canada. I have to say, I was very fortunate last year in December, I believe it was, I was in Montreal, and I had a round table with youth, and we had those difficult conversations. And I asked the question if they wanted to ask their parents, or if they wanted to ask someone about the issue of cannabis, who would they turn to? And there were some parents in the room that were there that day. And to the shock of the parents all thought their children were going to say mom or dad. But actually, it was coaches, it was mentors, it was teachers. So with respect to the tools that we're preparing, it's really important that we ensure that those frontline service providers and also the mentors of our children receive some information in the event that they choose to have that conversation. So moving forward, we are certainly going to make the investments. We're developing tools right now through my department at Health Canada, and there's going to be a national launch of a program come March. And again, we also have heard from our Indigenous communities that they also want to ensure that the programs that we're going to be launching are going to be culturally sensitive and also that meets their linguistic needs. So we are certainly moving ahead and following the advice of Colorado that if they had to do it again, they would certainly make the investments up front to make sure that youth receive the proper information that they need regarding the risks associated to cannabis.
Quick question. Have you implemented the $46 million program? Yes or no? Because the work that you've done up to this point is about drugs. It could include cannabis, but specifically the cannabis program that you're talking about, the $46 million investment. When's it starting? Because it affects the implementation process that you want to go through. Thank you.
Thank you very much again
for your question. If you give me just a quick answer, because I've got one last question I'd like to ask.
Well, we have started making some investments. We're in the process of developing a program through Health Canada right now.
Have you implemented the program?
We are in the process of developing the program, and the program will be implemented in March. And if I might add, with respect to drug-free kids as well, that information has been made available to Canadians since last fall. And again, we continue to partner with different groups in the community to make sure that we can get the message out there.
It's always different between when you talk about something and when something actually comes into force. Mm-hmm. Last question. Earlier today, I guess it's for you again, Minister, thank you. Unnamed government officials told the Globe and Mail that you are here before us this afternoon to, quote, reassure senators that the transition will be done in a responsible and orderly fashion, end quote. Given the widespread concerns we've already heard loud and clear from a diverse range of concerned stakeholders, especially in the area of public education for our youth, wouldn't it be responsible and orderly for your government to provide more time to educate our youth? Our issue is the timing. Well, finish my question. Thank you.
So timing with respect to public education, if I may clarify it? Is that the question?
That's right.
Okay, that's fine. With respect to the public education component, as I've indicated, we have learned much information from our friends in Colorado. And again, they told us if they had to do this again, they would certainly move forward in making sure that public awareness was in place before the product became legal. And that's exactly what we're doing. Different departments are doing different campaigns. Governments are doing campaigns, and also we're supporting agencies that are already providing the work to individuals.
Thank you.
Sénatrice Saint-Germain, s'il vous plaît.
Senator Saint-Germain. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the ministers. I first of all want to assure you on behalf of the Independent Senators Group that we hope that we will be able to do a well-documented, rigorous, and objective study of the legislation on cannabis. We are aware that the status quo poses problems, but we also want to ensure that in the best interests of the public, the many issues with health, safety and security, and others will be seriously studied. And you can see, given the questions of my colleagues, that we want to analyze this legislation thoroughly before arriving at a decision. My question deals with legalization, and in particular, Part 8 of Bill C-45 that will make it possible to grow at least four marijuana plants at home. So I would like to know, when that is implemented, how the police forces will administer this, whether we're talking about the RCMP, the Quebec police forces in Ontario and Quebec, or the municipal forces. How will this be implemented? Will police officers need a search warrant to go into homes? Will there be a system developed for whistleblowers? How concretely will that provision be implemented?
We have been, of course, working closely with provincial and municipal authorities as well as police forces to make sure that that they are amply informed and equipped to deal with the issues that they will need to deal with under this legislation. The issue of enforcement falls to the police force of local jurisdiction, so that whoever has the existing authority today to administer the criminal code in various jurisdictions across Canada will have that same jurisdiction with respect to cannabis. We have taken particular steps, as you know, to make sure that police forces are equipped with the training and with the devices they will need to deal with drug-impaired driving. That's in a different piece of legislation in Bill C-46, so I won't wade into that in detail other than to say we have made a $274 million investment, which is presently under very active discussion with our provincial counterparts in terms of the distribution and the flow of that money across the country to make sure that police forces have the training and have the tools they need to enforce the law once Parliament has given its approval. And I turn to the Minister of Justice to offer more information about the necessary procedures in terms of searches and search warrants.
Well, thank you, Minister, and thank you, Senator, for the question. And I will point out that we have provided, by way of the backgrounder with respect to Bill C-45, a charter statement that speaks to where the charter is engaged. But to build on what my colleague has talked about in terms of enforcement, police officers will have to have judicial authorization before they can enter into a private residence.
Senator Eggleton, please.
Well, Ministers, Parliamentary Secretary, and your officials, welcome. Thank you for being here today. My question concerns edibles. In October, C-45 was amended to include edibles containing cannabis, but this amendment is not to come into force for 1 year after the act comes into force. Edibles, of course, are a tricky issue in the debate over legalization. One concern is that ingesting cannabis is easier for the uninitiated than inhaling it. Edibles also take longer to have an effect, which can lead to unintended overconsumption. The biggest worry, of course, is that they can appeal to children and youth, especially if they come in the form of candy or pastry. My concern is that by waiting a year to legalize and regulate edibles, we will allow the illicit and unregulated market to flourish in the meantime, which is what you've said you want to stop. This is why you want to get this into effect, to protect our children and youth. Now, I do appreciate the need for development of efficient regulation, but the task force on cannabis has already outlined what these regulations on edible products would look like, and they've borrowed from other jurisdictions that have gone through this experience. And this includes packaging regulations, THC content, well as standardized products that would not appeal to children. These initial regulations may prove not to be perfect if they were put into effect now, but allowing legal edibles from the outset would deter Canadians from continuing to purchase and produce such items illegally. So my question is, instead of waiting, would it not be more prudent to legalize and regulate edibles when the Act comes into force, with a mandated review of these regulations sometime in the near future to update them?
Question. The task force was very clear that if we choose and if we want to displace the black market, which is absolutely an objective of this legislation, or part of the objective, we absolutely recognize that we are going to have to incorporate edibles within the regime. At this point in time, however, once again, having learned from our friends and colleagues in Colorado, they've indicated that there's certainly complex regulations that have to be put in place in order to effectively implement edibles within the regime. In your statement or in your question, sir, you had indicated that the issue of overconsumption and accidental ingestions. Those are some specific areas as to why we certainly want to take our time in putting the proper regulations in place. We recognize that those regulations can be complex, so what we've decided for the coming into force of Bill C-45, once it becomes legal, that Canadians will have access to dry cannabis, fresh cannabis in oils. If Canadians choose that they want to make products within their homes, if they choose that they do want to make some type of edible products, they'll absolutely be able to do so. But we certainly, moving forward, we have indicated that within the 1 year after the coming into force, that we would introduce the edibles within the regime. And with that, we certainly also want to ensure that the proper regulations are in place, and also that the proper packaging will be available with the proper THC contents, and also, again, to make sure that the public education and awareness is done, so people are certainly aware of the issues of overconsumption and the rest of it. So those are the types of reasons as to why that we're taking our time with respect to that part of it, because we certainly want to make sure that we get it right. But we understand that if we want to displace the black market, there's a demand for those types of products, and we absolutely have to make sure that they're going to be available to Canadians in due course.
Well, allowing people to make these things in their home leaves them unregulated and uncontrolled and at risk, particularly for children. So, and as I pointed out, the illicit market continues during this period of time. So I would hope that you would get a handle on this just as quickly as you possibly can. Another thing that needs to be dealt with is the question of marketing that could appeal to children and youth by the kinds of names that can be used for these substances. Strains being sold in other jurisdictions have names that could appeal to children. These include Fruity Pebbles, Candyland, Animal Cookies, to name just a few. These names would need to be clearly visible on the packaging for customers to differentiate between the products. So my question is, will the government regulate the names of the strains of cannabis that are to be sold so that they do not appeal to children and youth?
For the question, and it's a very good question. Under Bill C-45, we are certainly proposing that we're going to have very strict and clear regulations and controls over what can be packaged, the labeling, the marketing, and the advertising to children. At the end of the day, we certainly want to make sure that any information that's going to be present on the package will absolutely in no way be appealing or entice children to want to use those types of products. So again, in the proposed regulations that we've just finished the consultation on, we've discussed exactly that. With respect to the packaging as well, it's very much almost very similar to plain packaging. Basically on the package, they will be very limited as to what information can be on there. Marketing or companies will not be able to use characters or animals or anything, again, that would be appealing to children. And finally, the information that needs to be on the package is the THC level or the CBD level, so that Canadians can make informed decisions regarding what they're purchasing and what is the content of what they're purchasing. And finally, we want to make sure that there's health warnings on the package. And those will be rotational types of health warnings like we see on tobacco products now. But when it comes to marketing to children, packaging and labeling, we absolutely want to have strict requirements to ensure that in no way this will be appealing to our children.
Thank you. Sénateur Carignan, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for the three ministers. On June 1st, 2015, the Quebec Superior Court convicted 3 tobacco manufacturers and fined them $15 million. This decision is being appealed, and the court is deliberating. The Quebec Superior Court concluded that the tobacco companies were manufacturing and marketing products that were dangerous to health, and that they had misled customers as to the dangers associated with the products. The court also concluded that the tobacco companies were at fault because they did not inform customers of the dangers, and therefore they violated acts and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. A number of provinces, including Quebec and British Columbia, are taking tobacco companies to court to get compensation for victims. There are other groups as well that have launched court cases against tobacco companies. So you have been informed and alerted to the issues of health problems for those under the age of 25 in particular from cannabis use. In Quebec, for example, the public health leaders have indicated that psychosis increases with those who have used cannabis at least once, and those that use it intensively run a risk that is 3 times or more higher. In the smoke of cannabis, there are many cancer-causing chemicals, and those who smoke marijuana have a higher risk of cancer. The Canadian Pediatrics Society conducted a longitudinal study that showed that the use of cannabis in adolescents created many later health problems. Right now, the THC content is much higher than was the case in the past, and that will create more problems. The Public Health Directors Association of Quebec has indicated that when cannabis is used regularly, it creates often respiratory symptoms that are irreversible. And my question to all of you is as follows. Have you received legal advice on the likelihood of having millions of dollars in court costs charged to the federal government? The provinces will also run that risk, and companies as well that are involved.
Between all of you.
Maybe I'll begin, Madam Speaker, and invite my colleagues to follow. But the situation that you have described, Senator Carignan, exists under the current laws of Canada. The current situation, the way the law has existed in this country for over 90 years, has resulted in exactly the type of situation that you have described. Obviously, the current law has failed. It has not protected our kids. It has not served public health. It has not kept $9 or $8 or $7 billion in illegal profits out of the hands of organized crime. The current regime has not worked. What we're trying to get away from is perpetuating the failure of the status quo. We have to change the regime to be more effective in protecting our kids, more effective in keeping marijuana out of the hands of young people, more effective in stopping the flow of illegal cash to organized crime, and more effective in creating safer driving conditions on the road. The status quo will not do that. Bill C-45 and Bill C-46 give us a greater opportunity and a greater prospect of success in public health and public safety.
Oui, encore une fois, si je peux un peu réitérer les...
If I could just follow up on what my colleague has said, the public health approach is really at the heart of Bill C-45 because we recognize that we have to regulate access for our young people to cannabis. We have to prevent access to an illegal market that is even larger than in other countries. When I talk to people about this issue, I am certainly saying that we are not at all encouraging young people to use cannabis. We want Canadians to have access to proper information so that if they use cannabis, at least they have a regulated system. There will be a minimum age imposed, and we are trying to prevent children in particular from having access.
Well, I mean, just to thank the Senator for the question and to backstop and support what my colleagues have indicated. I mean, we've learned a lot from the reality of tobacco. We are taking an approach right up front to ensure that we place, as the Minister has said, prohibitions in terms of packaging, in terms of promotion, and are very upfront with what is required in order to comply with the Act. And as for legal advice, we're being very open and upfront with the requirements that are necessary in order to comply with the Act, and ensuring that there are warnings, that there are appropriate packaging about the health risks, not to mention the robust public education and communications plan that the Minister has detailed.
You say that there hasn't been any legal advice, but have there been any discussion about whether companies would be compensated if there were court cases brought by customers? The answer is no.
To say no, as my colleague has indicated, but we're being very proactive with respect to the Cannabis Act that we're putting forward and the requirements that are necessary to be in place in order to become a licensed producer, to ensure that there's compliance with the Act. We've been very upfront and are going to continue to do that and working with individuals and jurisdictions right across the country.
Est-ce que j'ai encore du temps?
2 minutes.
Do I still have some time? Yes, a couple of minutes. You indicated earlier that you had consulted Colorado about their experience, and I would like to know about Norway, which is the country in which there is the lowest use of cannabis by young people in the world. Have you sent any officials to study what Norway has done in order to have the lowest use rates by young people? Our objective, primarily, is to look at the situation in Canada. When we look at our statistics, we see that young Canadians between 15 and 19 are the main users, and we have to target that problem. We are basically taking a public health approach to deal with that issue. We are restricting the use of cannabis, and we are putting in place regulations through Bill C-45. And we recognize that the current system does not work.
My question is to the Minister of Health. I'm chair of the Senate's Agriculture and Forestry Committee, so my questions relate to the legislation and regulations for the cultivation and production of marijuana cannabis and hemp cannabis. So hemp only contains trace amounts of THC, which does not result in any psychoactive effect when compared to marijuana, and it has many different uses. It's a great crop. Its uses range from building materials to cosmetic supplies. So the government has a deadline, and it's indicated that there will be no proposed draft regulations available for consultation, only a summary of feedback. And the industry is concerned that because Bill C-45 will create a new regulatory regime without following the usual or normal regulatory process, how will industry know what the regulations are until they become law?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and it's a very good question. Many Canadians are not aware, or some perhaps are and some aren't, that hemp derives from the cannabis plant. And you're right, it's absolutely a growing industry in Canada, and many products are made as a result of it. Thus far, the hemp product has been controlled or streamlined under the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act, better known as the CDSA. What we are proposing going forward is that the hemp product will be brought under the cannabis legislation, as we truly feel that by proposing to streamline the regulation, it would certainly match the risk level, because we do know, as you've indicated, that the level of THC is very, very low. So we just feel it's really important to match the risk with respect to that. So we certainly want to be very flexible, as we know that the hemp industry is a developing industry in Canada, and we certainly want to promote that.
Okay, and thank you. In view of that, in the development of the regulations, would you intend to clearly delineate in the regulatory framework which parts would apply to marijuana cannabis and which parts would apply to hemp cannabis?
Thank you. We are going to be publishing very soon a report on what we heard with respect to the regulations, and that should be coming up very soon, and I'm sure that the individuals that are involved in this industry will be very pleased and looking forward to seeing what's going to be in that report.
Okay, I'm sure they will. And my final question is, it's related to outdoor cultivation. How does the government intend to easily distinguish between the outdoor production hemp cannabis and marijuana cannabis? Should marijuana cannabis production be limited to indoor facilities?
So just to qualify your question, are you talking about cultivation in homes? Is that what you're...
No, I'm talking about larger amount of cultivation. Will you be having the marijuana cannabis production limited to only indoor facilities? And if you do, you've got a competition there in your ear. And if you do, obviously indoor cannabis is much easier to control for quality. So would cannabis that's used for recreational marijuana purposes be limited to indoor production facilities?
I'm going to ask my deputy, if he doesn't mind, just to provide a bit of more detail with respect to that, if
Sure,
that's okay.
thank you.
Maybe, Senator, just the issue of whether to have outdoor cultivation or not was part of the consultation that the government has just completed. So there was a 60-day consultation period on the detailed what the regulatory regime will look like. Ministers will have to kind of take stock of the consultations and what was heard in that, and the plan will be, as the minister said, to publish a fairly detailed accounting of what was heard in the consultation and then where the government intends to go. And this issue of growing outdoors is something that was part of the consultation. There were kind of views on both sides, if you like, and then the government will be, I guess, announcing where they intend to go with that.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Seidman.
For the Minister of Health. Minister, you agree that Canada's successful approach to tobacco regulation means our youth smoking rates are among the lowest in the world. Yet, public health experts like the Canadian Cancer Society tell us that legalizing cannabis will undermine our success in reducing youth smoking by renormalizing tobacco use and reducing their perceptions of risk. That's because the most common way to consume cannabis is by smoking a joint, often rolled with tobacco. Minister, are you jeopardizing the health of our kids by creating a whole new generation of smokers?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I guess to address that question, I think that I first of all have to start off by saying we are dealing with a problem that's already existing within our country right now. We recognize that the youth rate of cannabis use within this country is amongst the highest. If we look at the ages between group between the ages of 15 and 24 amongst our youth and young adults, we recognize that they are consuming cannabis. So with this proposed legislation that we're bringing forward, we're proposing an approach to deal with an existing problem. With respect to how youth choose to consume cannabis, they consume it in different ways, as you've indicated. But with respect to the legislation that we're bringing forward, we certainly want to have and are having a public health approach to effectively deal with the implementation. First and foremost, we have to look at the legalization regime. We absolutely want to restrict access to cannabis to young people, and the minimum federal age that we've set is at 18 years of age. If provinces and territories choose that they want to increase that age, they certainly can. It's completely at their discretion. And finally, we want to ensure that if youth or Canadians choose that they want to purchase cannabis, we also want to make sure that it's going to be done in a regulated establishment. With respect to the issue of other ways of consuming cannabis, as I've indicated earlier today, the issue of edibles and other products will certainly be brought forward in the legislation, but we've indicated that will come into force 1 year after the coming into force of this phase of the legislation. So we certainly want to address both issues. And finally, I guess, people that are of age of consent and that choose to purchase cannabis as well, they will have the opportunity at the coming of force to either buy fresh cannabis, dried cannabis, or oils. And many individuals may choose to also want to make products at their home in an edible form, or to put it in capsules in their tea, or however they choose to consume it. But those are the types of options that will be available to Canadians once the regime becomes legal.
So, Minister, you've talked a lot about harm reduction, but you've told us nothing about how the government is going to encourage Canadians to stop smoking joints in favor of safer alternatives. Health Canada has already acknowledged that non-combustible vaping products are a potentially less harmful alternative to tobacco. The same is true for cannabis. So, Minister, if the true intent of this legislation is to make it less dangerous to use cannabis, why does it do nothing to get Canadians to stop burning and smoking it?
Well, once again, a big part of our component of this legislation, is going to be the public education and awareness as well. So information needs to be provided to Canadians actually on the packaging regarding the health risks related to smoking cannabis or ingesting cannabis. And moving forward, we have indicated that we want to have strict regulations and controls regarding the packaging, the marketing, and all that goes with it to ensure that we can provide Canadians with exactly that, the proper information regarding the harms associated to cannabis consumption in whatever form that they choose.
Minister, you say you're taking the same regulatory approach to as tobacco, but that's simply not the case. Tobacco regulation prohibits all forms of marketing. Tobacco smoking is banned in all indoor public places, and soon cigarettes will be sold in identical plain packages. Compare that with the loopholes of the proposed cannabis regulations, which leave the door open to child-friendly advertising, don't specify how marketing restrictions will be enforced, and allow smoking indoors. Even the plain packaging called for by the government's own cannabis task force is missing in action. Minister, my question is simple. Will you commit today to the same plain packaging restrictions for cannabis and cigarettes? Just yes or no.
Very clearly, Bill C-45 proposes very strict and clear controls when it comes to packaging, labeling, marketing, and advertising to children. I really have to say it's almost identical. The difference with respect to packaging when it comes to cannabis use, however, we really have to make sure that when it comes to cannabis, that information will be available on the package with respect to the THC content and the CBD content. So those are the types of additional informations that are going to be allowed on the package, because we want to ensure that Canadians are going to know exactly what they're going to be purchasing when they come, if they attend a retail outlet for purchase. When it comes to the issue of marketing to children, we've made it very, very clear. We really want to make sure that in no way are any of these products going to be enticing children to want to use them. And those are the types of regulations that we are going to be putting in place to ensure that we protect our children, because we certainly don't want them to feel that this is a product that's appealing to them.
Well, it's disappointing not to hear the commitment that you will commit to the same plain packaging restrictions for cannabis and cigarettes, but I'd like to move on. Minister, the government's very fond of talking about evidence, but speaking for myself as a health researcher, it really doesn't add up. In fact, research from around the world suggests that cannabis legalization will lead to more use, especially among our kids. A comprehensive study from the RAND Corporation found that cannabis sales in the United States are related to increases in overall cannabis use and greater dependence among youth. These findings are supported by the largest study ever conducted to understand the effects of cannabis legalization on adolescents. The study of 38 countries found that cannabis liberalization is associated with higher levels of regular cannabis use among teenagers. Minister, have you reviewed these studies? And how do you square the evidence that kids will use more cannabis with your responsibility to protect their health and safety?
Well, I have not reviewed that particular study, but I certainly have reviewed some studies that have said just the opposite. If we look at the issue of Colorado, they've actually indicated that there's been a decrease in the consumption of youth consuming cannabis. And they've been doing their research since this became legal within their country. The challenge that we're having right now, however, with respect to research in Canada is that because cannabis is an illegal product right now, it's very difficult to conduct research in the area. So by moving forward with respect to the area of research, we certainly want to make investments in that area as well to be able to learn what are the long-term and short-term effects related to cannabis. The other thing as well that we also have to recognize, as indicated, we have to remember that we are addressing a current situation or current problem that's already existing within our country, and we can't forget that. And moving forward, we certainly want to restrict access to cannabis to young Canadians. That is really why that we're moving forward, because the current system is certainly not working.
Well, Minister, you've talked a lot about Colorado. It's a single case with very limited data collected over a very short period of time, and it has produced mountains of conflicting evidence. In fact, many early studies that found no increase in teen pot use following legalization are flawed. They failed to control for factors like whether a jurisdiction allows sales, cultivation, or only possession. That means the studies really don't give us the full picture. More comprehensive research suggests what common sense has already told us.
For your question and answer.
Thank you. Legalizing marijuana makes teenagers more likely to use and to use more often. So why is the government telling Canadians the opposite?
Well, moving forward, as we've indicated, by legalizing, restricting access, and regulating the cannabis use within our country, we certainly want to make sure that Canadian youth will not have access to cannabis, and that is why that we are moving forward with this legislation. At the present time, it is easier for teenagers to go to behind the school and purchase cannabis than it is for them to go and buy tobacco or liquor. So we certainly recognize that the approach is not working that we have right now. Moving forward, we want to make sure that we can restrict access to cannabis, and that is why that we're moving forward with this legislation. With respect to the harm effects related to cannabis, as I've indicated earlier, I am in no way indicating that there is no risks associated to cannabis use. To the contrary, and that is why it's going to be extremely important for us as a government to invest in public education and awareness to ensure that we're educating our children regarding the risks and myths associated to cannabis, and also to demystify what they sometimes think is a reality and it really isn't. So it's going to be a public health approach, we have to have a collaborative approach, and to ensure that Canadians are provided with the right information and the right tools in order to make informed decisions.
Thank you. Senator Black.
Ministers, officials, welcome. It's good to have you in the Senate. I also would like to commend you all for the tremendous amount of work that you've done, obviously, to prepare for today, but more importantly, to manage this file. It's obvious in the level of your responses. That is appreciated. Before asking my question, I also want to acknowledge my friend and fellow Albertan, Anne McClellan, for the tremendous work and leadership that she has provided to Canada on this file. Oh. As the federal government pursues cannabis legislation through Bill C-45, it is clear that all three orders of government, the federal, the provincial, and the municipal, will have a role to play in ensuring that legislation is implemented safely and effectively. A recent estimate by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities suggests that it will cost local governments across the country anywhere from $210 to $335 million per year to administer the issues surrounding cannabis in their communities. So for a city in Alberta of 500,000 people, it would represent a budget increase of up to $4.75 million per year. Late last year, the federal government came to an agreement, an encouraging agreement, with the provinces to split the excise tax revenues 25-75 between themselves and the provinces. In addition to this, the federal government announced limited funding for the training of police and purchasing of equipment needed to enforce the legislation. Given that excise tax revenues are going directly to the provinces with no strings attached, some provinces may choose not to transfer additional funding to municipalities. What measures are you proposing to put in place to ensure that municipalities have the tools to deliver on their obligations and meet the commitments that you want met?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and I have to agree with you. The Honourable Anne McClellan did tremendous work in helping us moving forward with respect to this ambitious work that we've are moving forward. With respect to the issue of taxation, I was extremely pleased that the Finance Minister met with his provincial and territorial colleagues this December, and finally that they were able to come